I teach in the business school. In 2006, after a class discussion on credit card lending, an undergrad shared with me that just the year before, he had accumulated so much credit card that he had to declare personal bankruptcy. The 2008 financial crisis started a national conversation about responsibility in lending. Who is responsible when a borrower doesn't repay a loan? The borrower who took it, my undergrad, or the lender who gave it, the credit card companies? Most people in the United States would say that it is the responsibility of the borrower. The financial crisis showed us that mortgage lenders also had part in this responsibility. However, the reasons why my undergrad declared bankruptcy and many mortgage borrowers lost their houses depends on reasons connected with long-term developments in the banking industry. I will talk about one of them, the replacement of loan officers by credit scoring. Credit scoring is an American invention of the 19th century. It was dreamed up by Louis Tappan. Louis Tappan is actually best known for being an abolitionist. He was actually portrayed in the movie Amistad. But he also founded the first credit scorer, the Louis Tappan Mercantile Agency, which is the precursor of current-day Dun & Bradstreet. It was widely imitated. Initially, it was just a ledger full of rumor and hearsay. Eventually, over the years, it became the FICO scores, the Experian scores, the TransUnion scores that we're all familiar with. It particularly took off in the 1970s. I have taken mortgages, credit cards, home equity loans, car loans. I have yet to meet a loan officer, and I imagine that is very similar for many of you. I have met plenty of loan salespeople, and I have filled out plenty of loan questionnaires, but decisions about my repayment capacity have been taken in some back room based on a mysterious algorithm over which I have little control. I learned about the role of loan officers in responsibility in lending because of my research in microfinance in Latin America. Microfinance is a peculiar type of lending in which the involvement of loan officers is absolutely fundamental, at least until recently. I first heard of microfinance in the early 90s when I was conducting research in the northeast of Brazil. I was studying shoemakers as part of a research project on programs to evaluate programs to evaluate the way the government could support the development of microenterprises. Back then, it was called New Microenterprise Finance. It was called microenterprise finance because it was about lending to microenterprises. For example, a shoemaker in Brazil needs leather. A microenterprise shoemaker didn't have the money to buy the leather. A microenterprise loan could give him the cash to actually go to the leather merchant and negotiate a better price that he could get otherwise. It was called new because of the will to distinguish it from prior microenterprise lending programs, which were rather irresponsible. Let me tell you a story. As part of my research project on shoemakers, I attended a meeting of the monthly meeting of an association of shoemakers in the northeast of Brazil. And I presented myself. I'm doing research. I'm helping the government figure out ways of supporting your microenterprise. What do you need? And predictably, they said loans. We need loans. So then I followed up, and I said, has any of you ever taken a government loan? And a tallest lender man raised his hand and said, yes. And without my prompting, he shared with me that he had used this loan to build a nice addition to his house, not to buy leather. And I was like, what's going on? So sure, a room over the garage made this man's life better. But similar to the expenses of the credit card expenses of my undergrad, it did not generate any revenue to pay back that loan. Lucky for this shoemaker, the microenterprise lender that gave him the money closed the doors before payment was due. Microfinance completely changed this. it began hiring and training highly skilled loan officers. The job of a microfinance loan officer is very hard. I learned about it while walking in the streets of El Alto in Bolivia with these loan officers. In the morning, they do sales. They go to street markets, and they talk with people like this woman selling cheese. Your cheeses are wonderful, are absolutely fabulous. How do you finance? Where do you get your milk? I work for Caja Los Andes. Do you need a loan? Not today? Please keep my business card. In the afternoon, they do repayment evaluation. They visit this woman's house or whoever they have identified as a potential borrower, and they evaluate how much can they actually repay. They learn funny things. For example, taxi drivers in La Paz in Bolivia, when they're bored, what they do is they stop for a bite. So what happens? When business is down, expenses are up, and so is their waistline. In the evening, they visit late payers, and they visit defaulting borrowers. It's not a very pleasant job. As you can imagine, they don't like it whatsoever. In Bolivia, people will put their furniture and their TVs as warranty for repayment. Can you imagine going into someone's house to take out their furniture, to take out the TV, and the kids are crying, and the dogs are barking? I remember they're telling me, like, we never see the dogs when we're evaluating the loans. Like, where do these dogs come from? Seems like they get them just for this from their neighbors. Right after, they have to go back to their office with their memories still fresh on exactly this, on how unpleasant it is to collect from someone who cannot pay their loan. And this is when they file the paperwork, and it's also when, as part of credit committees, they decide on new loans. Microfinance work with loan officers, relied on loan officers until the 2000s. Why? Brazil, Bolivia, and most of the countries where you have microfinance widespread, they don't have the national scoring systems available in the United States. But what has happened over the years? Computing capabilities, big data. This has facilitated for financial institutions to develop their own scoring systems. Why is so interesting for them, including in microfinance? Well, it's very interesting because it generates what? Efficiencies. It's much more efficient to evaluate borrowers' repayment capacity with the scoring algorithm than with an army of loan officers. Scoring thereby is here to stay. It's not going to go away. The challenge is to convince lenders that they need to invest on systems that avoid over-indebting their borrowers, that avoid having their clients defaulting on their loans. They can afford it. Let me show you some numbers. This graph shows you the average return on assets of all the US banks. And this is at a time of record profits in banking. This shows you actually a comparison between the average of the US banks and the ProCredit Bank. The ProCredit Bank is a bank that actually has an army of loan officers deciding on the repayment capability. Isn't it interesting that it almost matches perfectly? This right here, I have added the return on assets of credit card banks, which actually rely majorly on scoring. So what do you notice? What you notice is that profitability is much higher. But what else do you see? There's a high volatility. What is that is at the deep? At the deep is a repayment crisis. At the deep is borrowers that have defaulted on their loans and many who might have declared bankruptcy. This is problematic, isn't it? And it is problematic at least for two reasons. First, borrowers actually like scoring-based lending. They like scoring-based lending for many reasons. Remember my undergrad? So why did my undergrad declare bankruptcy? The reason he declared bankruptcy is because he had used his credit card for daily expenses, because he lost his job and he didn't want to move back with daddy. And because he didn't want to move back with daddy, he's like, why don't I use my credit card? Can you imagine him having that conversation with one of my loan officers? My loan officer would have never given him a loan for that. So borrowers, particularly the responsible ones, like scoring. The other reason is that responsible lending has actually moved beyond credit cards. It's not a problem of credit cards. Credit cards were the ones that use in scoring more broadly. But this has actually moved to other areas of lending. One of the areas of lending that this has moved to is actually student loans. Student loans and car loans. These are actually lenders. These are lenders who don't care about the repayment capability of their borrowers. So what can we do? Scoring is here to stay, but responsibility in lending doesn't have to. There's a couple of things that we can do. First, on the side of borrowers, we can increase financial literacy. Second, on the side of lenders, we can actually support financial institutions that are responsible lenders. In microfinance, we can do it through crowdfunding platforms such as kiva.org. I had planned to end this talk on a high note, talking to you and telling you about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which had just issued legislation protecting, encouraging and pressuring borrowers to incorporate systems so they don't over-indebt their borrowers. This legislation went through all the process. It became effective January 16, 2018. Unfortunately, Friday last week, the current administration stripped the CFPB of its enforcement capabilities. Thereby, I want to end this talk urging the current administration to restore to the CFPB its enforcement capabilities. I think it will go a long way to restore the responsibility in lending that we lost when loan officers became replaced by credit scoring. Thank you very much.